Good morning. How's everybody? I'm going to go ahead and get started. My name's Alan DiDonato. I'm a graduate of the seminary. I got my degree in philosophy here, and I also have a master's degree in classical archaeology. Teach at Central Piedmont in Humanities and Philosophy department. And I guess you're going to be joining me for my talk on defending the faithful. I was also told to make an announcement about the team apologetics ministry here at the seminary. There's some information in your packets about that, but team is Southern Evangelicals Apologetics Ministry, and we do apologetics conferences, various churches and colleges, and if you're at all interested in having more information, like I said, the information is in your little packet. But I know we're getting started a little bit late. This is a rather lengthy presentation, so I'm just going to go ahead and get started. And I've decided to title the talk, Defending the Faithful, an Apology for the Crusades, partly because I find equivocation somewhat amusing. As you know, apologetics is a defense of the faith. The word apology also can mean saying you're sorry for something. And when it comes to the Crusades, many people think this is exactly what Christians ought to be doing, is apologizing in the second sense. But this is not what I'm going to be doing in the course of this talk, but neither will I be presenting a defense of the faith, because this talk is not titled Defending the Faith, but Defending the Faithful. Partly because I believe that was the original purpose of the First Crusade, to defend the faithful Christians of the East, not, as many have asserted, including some evangelical scholars, the conversion of Muslims to Christianity. Some kind of military evangelism. It's also called Defending the Faithful because I believe that is what the original Crusaders were doing. And I'm going to be defending the position that they were taking, and something people have said true Christians should never do. But whether or not I'm a true Christian is really not the issue of this talk. I do want to investigate the issue of whether or not the Crusades are justifiable in any sense, and I'm going to assert that they were justifiable. You don't have to agree with that, but over the course of the talk, I hope to at least put to rest some common misunderstandings. And like I said, we only have a short time, so I should apologize already in the second sense if I don't get through this whole thing. It usually takes me about 57 minutes or so to go through this talk, and I know we're squeezed on time, so let's just dive in. Most of you are aware that religious faith is not only mocked and ridiculed, but often condemned as dangerous by many people in the modern secular world. And a large part of the anti-religious conversation focuses on what are called the evils of religion. And I'm going to hazard to guess that you've heard mention of this series of medieval wars known as the Crusades, usually in that context. And they become a favorite example of everything that's wrong with religion in general and Christianity in particular, as many have seen these as a black mark in Christian history. Both atheists and Christians alike sometimes take that position, that they're a textbook example of bigotry, oppression, hatred, and violence that is inherent in a religious mindset. But it's somehow surprising that more than 900 years after the First Crusade, they're still able to make media headlines. On the other hand, maybe it isn't so surprising because a lot of people believe that these wars are causally related to a lot of the problems of our own day, such as Islamic extremism and some of the terrorism that it sponsors. As a matter of fact, 2 months after 9/11, former President Bill Clinton, speaking at Georgetown University, said, "Those of us who come from various European lineages are not blameless." And then he summarized the medieval account of the taking of Jerusalem in 1099 by the Crusaders. Karen Armstrong, in her book Holy War, The Crusades and Their Impact on Today's World, argues that the Crusades left a legacy of religious violence that continues today in the Middle East. And it's a legacy she believed was entirely keeping with the nature of Christianity. She states, "Holy war is a deeply Christian act. Christianity had an inherent leaning towards violence despite the pacifism of Jesus. The pattern of holy war and violence seems to surface from some deep compulsion that is inherent in this tradition of monotheism, the worship of only one God." And the historical picture we get is something like this. You have imperialistic Western Christendom under the sway of some power-hungry Roman pontiff manipulates the uneducated, greedy masses of European Catholics into storming some relatively peaceful settlements in the Near East with the divine mandate to convert or slay heathen Muslims and Jews, colonize their lands, and pillage their wealth, all because God wills it. And Christians are then forced to go on the defensive. To defend Christianity, we somehow have to answer for the Crusades as if the Crusades are both an unjustified crime against humanity and a natural outgrowth of biblical teaching. And this apparently involves, like I said, an apology. We can look at some of the headlines. Muslims demand papal apology for the Crusades. The world's highest Sunni Muslim authority has demanded an official apology from the Pope for the medieval Christian Crusades. Sheikh Fawzi Zafzaf, president of the Interfaith Dialogue Committee at Al-Azhar University in Cairo, said his panel sent a request to the Vatican in February, it's 2005. The demand arose from Pope John Paul II's apologies to the Jewish people and his visits to Syria and Egypt a few years ago. Al-Azhar is only asking for similar treatment, he stated. Pope apologizes for the sins of the church. We're asking pardon for the division among Christians, for the use of violence that some have committed in the service of truth, and for attitudes of mistrust and hostility assumed towards followers of other religions, said Pope John Paul II. The phrase violence in the service of truth is an often used reference to the treatment of heretics during the Inquisition, the Crusades, and forced conversions of native people. The Crusades arrives in the Holy City to say, we're sorry. 900 years after the first Crusaders reached Jerusalem on a mission to free the Holy City from Islamic control, massacring tens of thousands of Jews and Muslims in the process, a second wave of Western Christians arrives today with a very different purpose, to apologize for the actions of their bloodthirsty forebears. The first party of about 50 apologizers will enter Jerusalem today, having walked from Cologne. By July 15th, the day in 1099 in which the walls of the city were breached after a 4-year journey by a ragtag army of fanatics and mercenaries from Western Europe, there should be about 2,000 participants. 900 years ago, our forefathers carried the name of Jesus Christ in battle across the Middle East, fueled by fear, greed, and hatred. They betrayed the name of Christ by conducting themselves in a manner contrary to his wishes and character. We deeply regret the atrocities committed in the name of Christ by our predecessors. Forgive us for allowing his name to be associated with death. This was the Reconciliation Walk. It took place between 1996 and 1999, and its participants were primarily American citizens, British citizens, and Germans, primarily Protestant. Now, a pilgrimage of about 2,500 people to Jerusalem is not very impressive compared to the numbers that were being pulled down during the Crusades, but for modern standards, that's still pretty shocking. Now, how do we respond to the atheist who says that the Crusades are just one more example of the violence and hatred that is inherent in religious faith? Well, perhaps we call attention to the historical record and point out that bigotry, oppression, hatred, and violence are accidental characteristics of the human condition and not essential characteristics of a religious condition. Religious belief is not a sufficient condition for acts of violence, as evidenced by countless numbers of Christian charities, orphanages, hospitals, and missions throughout the world. Neither is a necessary condition, as evidenced by some of the greatest massacres that have occurred in world history, occurring in the 20th century at the hands of atheistic regimes with apparently no religious motivation whatsoever. Fact is that people can be manipulated by some very good things into doing some very evil deeds. And acts of atrocity done for the sake of Christ do not constitute a reason to reject the truths of Christianity, any more than acts of atrocity done for money constitute a reason to reject the use of currency. How do we respond to the Christian desire to atone for sins of the past? I think partly with admiration. It's a Christian's responsibility to apologize when we misrepresent our Lord and Savior. And the fact is that we often do misrepresent our Lord and Savior. But on the other hand, we need to call attention again to the historical record so that we don't mistakenly assume some guilt that we ought not to assume. How do you respond to the Muslim demand for restitution? Again, with an even stronger demand to pay attention to the historical record. But it's no wonder that people misunderstand the history and aim of the Crusades when even evangelical scholars publish books like Christian Jihad, which asserts that the Crusades were not only indefensible, but undermined their very goal, which was the conversion of Muslims. The quote here was, "The major aim of the First Crusade to seek the conversion of the occupying forces of Islam in Jerusalem. If, as Urban preached at Claremont, this was the chief purpose, then in retrospect this desire was frustrated. Indeed, the subsequent millennia has been irreducibly harmed by the slaughter carried out by alleged warriors. They sought to force conversion by the sword, a type of Christian jihad. As logic dictates that forced conversion is no conversion at all, one is perplexed by the tragically misguided and brutally vicious crusaders." And continuing, "Certainly the Crusade period, and indeed all acts of forced conversion, have done no great service to the fulfillment of the Great Commission. The authentic Christian cannot defend the Crusades, the Inquisition, or other horrible movements in church history. Genuine authenticity demands a clear and unapologetic stance. God never called for a Christian army, and Jesus never promised salvation by bloodshed." So our goal is going to be to take a look at the actual history of the Crusades and ask ourselves the question, were the Crusades justifiable? But in answering that question, we're actually going to have to distinguish between two different respects in which they might be justifiable. First, as to their mission, that they were waged at all, and second, as to their manner, how they were waged. In dealing with the first issue, the mission, we're going to look at a further distinction. Can these wars be justified as an act, and can they be justified as an act of religion? And here we're going to look at two common accusations. One being that the Crusades were an unprovoked attack, and the second that the Crusades were about converting Muslims, as has already been presented. In dealing with the manner, we're going to look at a number of other accusations made about the Crusaders, their motives, their behavior, their failure, and the consequences. And some of these accusations are these: that the Crusades were motivated by greed, that the Crusades were called against the Jews as well, that the capture of Jerusalem was uniquely brutal and caused Muslim hatred of Europeans, and Muslims were persecuted by the intolerant Crusader states, that the Crusades accomplished nothing, were a total failure, and that the Crusades are responsible for current Muslim intolerance, Islam simply imitating European rage, and the Crusades are the basis of modern Islamic anti-Western anger. Now I'm going to begin by looking at the relationship between war and religion in general. It's always been intertwined. Even the most primitive cultures realized that the shedding of human blood brought certain spiritual implications. And in polytheistic cultures, where people conceive of their gods as immanent, limited, created beings that are anthropomorphized forces of nature, personifications of abstract principles, or intelligent causal agents that oversee some sphere of the human, natural, or divine realm, almost every culture has a god that's set apart to govern the sphere of war. You can see some of the names actually coming up the screen. I got a very short list of the many pagan gods that were gods of war. But people did believe that the gods had an actual role in society and in the state. Question then becomes, what about the theistic God? What about the God of Judaism? What about the God of Christianity? Is God a God of war as well? And here I would actually answer in a way, yes, he is. The transcendent eternal God, the omnipotent God, who is sovereign over his creation, to say that he's not God over war or any part of his creation is in fact to say that he's not God, because God is intimately associated with every aspect of his creation, and he holds every warrior in existence at every moment in time. And there are numerous passages in the Old Testament that also indicate that God has a say in the military history of his people. But with that being said, what I want to look at is the unique Christian perspective on war and give a careful attention to the moral issues that are involved there. Because war is actually not absent from the New Testament, but it is never commanded. Matter of fact, Jesus tells his disciples to love your enemies. In Matthew, we hear that phrase, love your enemies. You've heard it said, love your enemies and hate your neighbors, but I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Jesus makes it clear that his disciples also are not to wage war on behalf of his kingdom. In John 18, he says, my kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest. So war is never a Christian's obligation, never a Christian's religious duty. Though some might argue on scriptural grounds that war is a sphere reserved for the ruling secular powers. What about the church fathers? What did they say on war? Traditionally, they're men of peace. They were looking forward to the imminent return of Christ. And you have people like Justin Martyr, who said that now we refrain from making war upon our enemies. Tatian says, I decline military command. Clement of Alexandria says, for it is not in war but in peace that we're trained. And some actually believe that Christians had no business being involved in the military whatsoever, based on the fact that we're commanded not to murder and we're commanded never to serve another master. And in the early years, the state was another master. If you look at the quote from Tertullian, he says, there is no agreement between the divine and the human sacrament, the standard of Christ and the standard of the devil, the camp of light and the camp of darkness. One soul cannot be due to true masters, God and Caesar. And the state really was a separate master in those early years, one that was often at odds with the church. And this is verified by the numerous Christian persecutions that followed through by numerous Roman emperors. There were 10 major persecutions, some of them localized, some of them empire-wide. And by the Great Persecution in 303, things had gotten about as bad as they were going to get before things started to change. And the change came when the state actually aligned with the church, and that happens during the reign of Constantine. A lot of people looked at his conquest over Maxentius in 312 as God using the Roman army to actually stop the persecutions, and start to have ideas such as the idea that war could be a virtuous and God-ordained thing if it was used to defend the innocent. And it's what's called the Constantinian Synthesis. Now, it's not that the church becomes a military force. It never does. It was that the legitimate military force of the government becomes united to the church. And the state did have an essential military function. So what you see in the following years is Christian theologians start reflecting on the necessary moral dimension of warfare and start to develop what becomes known in the Middle Ages as the just war theory. And you have some of the most important theologians during the Middle Ages, like Augustine and Thomas Aquinas, who add to this concept of just war theory. So looking at Augustine, for instance, he believed that limits needed to be set on military actions by those who are going to profess to be Christian. And the key for just war would be things like proper action and the proper intention for going to war. And the criteria that are set up are these, that there should be a just cause, primarily to punish evil and to act in self-defense, never ever for gain. You have the idea of being called by a legitimate authority, the right intention, which must be to return to a state of peace. There had to be a probability of success. You have to make sure you don't have more violence than is necessary. And it should always be a principle of last resort. Augustine says, "The wise man will wage just wars, as if he were not all the rather lament the necessity of just wars if he remembers that he is a man. For if he were not just, he would not wage them, and would therefore be delivered from all war. For it is not the wrongdoing of the opposing party which compels the wise man to wage just wars, and this wrongdoing give rise to war would still be a matter of grief to man because it is man's wrong." Later, in the Middle Ages, Thomas Aquinas comes along and kind of develops his thinking on top of Augustine. And actually quoting from Augustine, he says, "True religion looks upon as peaceful those wars that are waged not for motives of aggrandizement or cruelty, but with the object of securing peace, of punishing evildoers, and of uplifting the good." And then he adds himself, "For it may happen that the war is declared by a legitimate authority and for a just cause, and yet be rendered unlawful through wicked intention." So again, it always comes back to intention there. The relationship between the state and the church has a very long and complicated history, especially during these early years in the Middle Ages. And the line starts to get blurred somewhere by the time we get to Charlemagne in the early Frankish Empire. Particularly when Charlemagne was crowned Roman emperor by Pope Leo III in 800. What you see is the church starting to assert its authority over the state, and the state being viewed as a protector of the church. And you get this idea of possibly a development of a Christian army. Now, note that the New Testament Christianity and the church fathers, as we've already seen, never ever had any kind of militaristic emphasis. In fact, it was contrary to the message of Christ. And it took centuries of this church-state interaction, tempered by the theological reflection of the morality involved, before you have this idea of a Christian army even developed. Now, looking at Islam, the relationship between the religion and war is going to be a very different picture. Okay, so first let's start with the idea, the question of how does Islam view the unbeliever? According to the Quran, the infidel are those who declare that God is Christ, the Son of Mary. The infidel are those who say God is one of three in a Trinity. Now, how do you treat the infidel? This is a big contrast to Jesus' love your enemies command. It says, "Believers, take neither Jews or Christians for your friends. Never be a helper to the disbelievers. Believers, do not make friends with those who have incurred the wrath of Allah." And then it gets worse. "Kill the disbelievers wherever you find them. The infidels are your sworn enemies." So it's not just love your enemies, but it's be enemies. Surah 9:5, the famous verse of the sword, says, "Then when the sacred months have passed, slay the idolaters wherever you find them, and take them, besiege them, and prepare for them each ambush. But if they repent and establish the worship and pay the poor due, then leave their way free. Therefore, when you meet the unbeliever, smite at their necks. Mohammed is Allah's apostle. Those who follow him are ruthless to the infidel. Prophet, make war on the infidel." So you've got lots and lots of these passages in the Quran. To understand the spread of Islam, you also have to understand the Muslim conception of the world as a divided sphere between two houses. You've got the Dar al-Islam and the Dar al-Harb, the house of Islam or submission and the house of war. And when we talk about world peace, we tend to have this understanding of peaceful coexistence with others that we disagree with. In Islam, when they talk about world peace, they're actually talking about world Islam. It's got this universal global mission. Other concepts that are important, actually, I'll skip that quote because I already talked about that. Actually, no, that's coming up now. A couple of the key concepts that are important in understanding the militaristic aspect of Islamic spread are concepts like the jizya and dhimmitud, which were actually mentioned in the last talk. But the jizya, again, is this tax that is on non-Muslims living in Muslim territories. that it gives them a particular freedom, in a sense, to practice their religion and exist in a protected status, which we call dimitude. The dhimmi status is a protected status. It does render you a second-class citizen, and there are a number of limitations that are put on your free expression of your religion. It's a humiliating status. You're not allowed to build new churches. You're not allowed to propagate the gospel. It does interfere very much with the Great Commission. So you can imagine being a Christian living under that system. Then we've got the concept of jihad. There are numerous forms of jihad. One of them is what's called jihad of the sword, which is to fight as a mujahid. And according to Islam, traditionally, this goes back even into the hadith. I'll give you a passage from Sahih Muslim. Talks about 3 options for dealing with non-believers. It says if they respond to you, accept it from them and desist from fighting them. If they refuse to accept Islam, demand from them the jizya. If they agree to pay, accept it from them and hold off your hands. If they refuse to pay the tax, then seek Allah's help and fight them. The struggle in the path of Allah, as this phrase is used in the Quran, assumes warfare and also has the promise of salvation attached to it, which is interesting. This is based in Quran Surah 9, which says, they are people who will achieve salvation, those who struggle in this way. And this concept is codified later in the Hadith as well. There are over 199 references to jihad as warfare in the Hadith. Al-Bukhari says, Allah guarantees that he will admit the mujahid in his cause into paradise if he's killed. And all 4 of the major Sunni schools of jurisprudence agree on the institution of jihad. The Maliki school says jihad is a precept of divine institution. If you go down to the bottom highlighted part, they have the alternative of either converting to Islam or paying the poll tax, short of which war will be declared against them. Then we finally get to Muhammad. Muhammad is the exemplar for the Muslim. He is the epitome of the perfect Muslim life, and he is the example that all Muslims, devout Muslims, try to emulate. And even though he initially preached a peaceful message after his conversion in 610, in 622, after the Hijrah, he becomes the military leader of the city of Yathrib, which is later known as Medina, and they have a very different turn in the way his preaching goes. You find out, of course, if you study his history, that he fought in over 66 battles and raids. Again, you've got Bukhari saying, Muhammad himself said, my livelihood is under the shade of my spear. Some of these wars were actually fought against the Jews. You have passages in Bukhari that actually say, Allah's apostle said, the hour will not be established until you fight with the Jews. And the stone behind which the Jew behind him will say, O Muslim, there's a Jew hiding behind me, so kill him. After the death of Muhammad, his successors and companions started to spread the religion through aggressive military advance into the surrounding regions. In a very quick time, you have the majority of the surrounding territory taken over for Islam. Under Abu Bakr, you have invasion of Syria. Under Umar, you've got the Levant invaded, Damascus, Mesopotamia, Jerusalem, Antioch, Egypt, the Persian Empire, all conquered within a short amount of time. Under the Caliph Uthman, you've got invasions of Anatolia, North Africa, Cyprus, Sicily, Nubia, Iberia, Crete, Rhodes, starting to spread even further throughout the Mediterranean and into Europe. Now, surprisingly, people have actually said that Christianity has spread in a very similar way. Another accusation is that Christianity spread the same way if you look at the example of Constantine. Now, no group, of course, is completely innocent of moral failure. I'm not trying to justify every action of Constantine or anybody that professed to be Christian in the ancient or medieval world, but it doesn't follow that Christianity and Islam are on the same exact moral footing, or that all religions are morally equivalent, or that not every religion has the same capacity to incite violence. The fact is that Christianity actually spread under persecution, had no civil authority, had no militaristic arm, and it spread basically through preaching and the way Christians lived. It was Rome that adopted Christianity, so the expansion of the Roman Empire and the expansion of Christianity are two separate things. The Roman Empire had actually reached its maximum extent long before the time of Constantine, and missionaries were still spreading Christianity through peaceful means such as preaching. Islam, on the other hand, used the sword from the beginning. Now, it does forbid forced conversion, technically speaking, but it doesn't forbid forced social and political hegemony, and a lot of conversion did take place under the oppression of dhimitude. More surprisingly, while the Crusades are blamed on religious motives, the Islamic Empire has sometimes been explained away as a defensive action by being motivated by factors other than religion. Another accusation is the jihadis were merely defending their lands from non-Muslims. The fact is, Arabia was never under attack by the surrounding powers, the Romans or the Persians. They didn't seem to have any interest whatsoever in Arabia. Islam ended up sweeping out of those territories and engulfing cultures that had never had any contact whatsoever with Arab or Islamic traditions. Islam actually invaded Christian Europe, which is very far removed from the Near East and North Africa as well. Another accusation we can look at is that Muslim conquest was not motivated by religion, but by factors such as economics. Again, there's no evidence of this either. As far as the population of the time, there didn't seem to be any great population explosion going on in Arabia. We know that the caravan trade was thriving at the time. Economics seemed to be doing pretty well. And when we look at the conquest, we see that the people that were conquering were actually very much committed to the spread of Islam. And a great example of this is the Conquest of Persia. When the Sasanian Emperor Yazdgard sued for peace with the Muslim general, he said, "We'll give you land for peace." And the response by the Muslims was, "This fight is about conversion. Accept jizya or Islam." And that brings us to the Crusades. Were the Crusades justifiable? Going back to our two questions. First, were they justifiable as an act? And were they justifiable as an act of religion? Accusation one that I'm going to look at is the Crusades were an unprovoked attack. Is this true? We're going to have to look at some of the history of what was going on in Europe, and later we'll go back to the Middle East. But let's start with the Spanish struggle. This is sometimes viewed as the original Crusade. The Muslim armies invaded Spain in the year 711. Tariq ibn Ziyad overthrew the Christian Visigothic kingdom there, actually sent King Rodrigo's head back to Damascus after decapitating him. By 716, almost the entire peninsula was in Muslim hands. It wasn't until about 718 that you have the first Christian victory at Covadonga, and some people believe this is the start of what's called the Reconquista. Of course, the Reconquista, or the reconquest of Christian Spain, is a long, long process. It doesn't finish until about 1492. And it does begin in the north. By the time we get, and if you look at the map, you can see slowly how the territories from the north are taken back until you get to the 11th century, and it's still the majority of Spain was in Muslim hands. In the 11th century, you have a number of popes calling for assistance to the Christian in Spain. Pope Alexander II in 1063 actually offered relief from penance to the knights that would be willing to go and aid their brethren there. They were also very aware of Jewish population in that region as well. And you do know that the Muslims in 1066 were massacring the Jewish population of Granada. It's a famous incident there. The Pope, on the other hand, was very strict about making sure that Christian soldiers understood that Jews are to be treated very differently. It actually says, "Protect the Jews who live among you so that they may not be killed by those setting out to Spain against the Saracens. For the situation of the Jews is greatly different from that of the Saracens." Later in the century, 1073, you've got Pope Gregory VII, who encourages knights to go on crusade. And by the 1085, you've got a great Christian victory with the fall of Toledo. This is right prior to the First Crusade. What about the Frankish struggle? A little bit further to the north, you've got Muslim armies starting to come across the Pyrenees Mountains in 721. They're stopped by Duke Eudo of Aquitaine briefly. They're able to seize Nîmes in 725. And then the Great Invasion in 731. The army comes over led by Abdurrahman. Let's back up 1 second. And is actually able to defeat Duke Eudo, but luckily is stopped by Charles Martel at the very famous Battle of Tours in 732. Greatly outnumbered, he defeats the Muslim army. But this is not the end of Muslim incursions into France, as a lot of people sometimes assume. They tried again, 735, 792, 848. They're very persistent for a very long time, but luckily the Franks were able to hold off the Islamic onslaught and protect Christian Europe, at least from the west. As far as Christian Europe from the east, we have to rely on the Roman Empire, which endures a much longer struggle and a much more persistent threat. As a matter of fact, what we call the Byzantine Empire, sometimes referred to as the Roman Empire, which is what they call themselves, in the very first 50 years of the growing Islamic Empire, they lost the majority of their empire. places like Egypt, Palestine, Syria, and 3 of the 5 patriarchates at Alexandria, Jerusalem, and Antioch, the great bishop seats, were seized and are now in Islamic control. Constantinople itself was attacked by 672 under Muawiyah. About 50,000 troops attacked the city, and luckily they were able to repel the invasion because they had advances like things like Greek fire. Another attack, a larger attack, 717, takes place with about 100,000 soldiers sent against the city of Constantinople, and Emperor Leo III is able to hold off that invasion. By the time we get to the 10th century, the great Abbasid Empire is starting to fragment. There was some weakness among the Muslims, and the Byzantines are able to actually retake some of that territory, particularly temporarily, the city of Antioch. But then things get very bad again in the middle of the 11th century. A new threat was on the horizon. This is the Turks, who came in from the east, were new converts to Islam, were very passionate, and in 1071, at the Battle of Manzikert, they defeated the Roman army and were able to take the greater chunk of Anatolia from Roman hands, and actually set up their sultanate right across from Constantinople, the old Christian city of Nicaea. There's also struggle in the center of Europe, in Italy itself. Invasions of Sicily began as early as the 7th century. A number of failed invasions, but they came back again in the 9th century, took Palermo, Sicily, Taormina, a number of other cities. Eventually Sicily fell into Muslim hands. In the 840s, southern Italy itself was invaded. Taranto, Bari, Capo, Benevento taken, and by 843 and 846, the Muslims were actually right outside of Rome, and the Pope paid the Muslim armies to depart. And I'm sure this was viewed at the time by the Muslims as jizya. This was submission. A little bit later in the century, the Byzantine emperor did launch campaigns to retake the southern portion of Italy, and was successful. By the middle of the 11th century, they had taken back most of southern Italy and were attempting to free Sicily. Unfortunately, the Normans came in at that time and stopped the Byzantine success, but the Normans themselves, also being Christians, were interested in driving the Muslims from that territory. In 1057, Robert Guiscard and his brother eventually began a successful campaign, and by 1091, the Normans had driven the Muslims out of Sicily and returned that into Christian hands. And this, again, prior to the First Crusade. And we have the pilgrim struggle. Pilgrimage was a tradition that goes way back in Christian history, even earlier in Jewish history. That was a precedent set by the Jews, traveling to the Holy Land to see various sites. We know of Christians as early as the 2nd century visiting Jerusalem. By the time we get to the 4th century, there was a great passion for pilgrimage. Under Constantine, you have the excavation of a lot of holy sites, a lot of churches being set up. In 335, Constantine set up the Church of the Holy Sepulchre over the supposed site of Jesus' burial. And this becomes the most sacred site to Christian pilgrims. We know of, in the 4th century, a number of pilgrims coming all the way from Western Europe. In the 5th century, pilgrimage was so popular that you've got over 300 hostels and monasteries set up to house what were approximately 6,000 daily pilgrims in the city of Jerusalem. By 638, Jerusalem falls into Muslim hands. Luckily, the Caliph Umar does assure that he's not going to station troops in Christian churches, and the pilgrimage is still allowed to go on. It was still okay around 800. The Caliph at the time allowed Charlemagne to have nominal control over the sacred sites, even though Charlemagne never actually went to the Holy Land. And then pilgrimage starts to develop more and more of this atmosphere of penance and atonement, particularly during the 9th and 10th centuries. Particularly under the reforms of the Cluny movement. What you start hearing as pilgrimage starts to become more and more popular during these centuries is some of the trouble that was going on with the pilgrims overseas. Not overseas, but in the Middle East. You've got reports coming back in the 8th century, the 9th century, the 10th century. Some of the things are on the screen there. 70 pilgrims attacked here, 90 pilgrims attacked here, people being crucified, monasteries being burned, monks themselves being burned. And as though it got worse in the 10th century, it gets to its worst in the early 11th century under Al-Hakim. In 1004, he starts a major persecution of Christians and Jews, driving a lot of them from the region, and over a 10-year period, over 30,000 churches and shrines were destroyed. And this was a persecution that went all the way from Egypt up to Syria. He was the caliph in Egypt, by the way. In 1009, he destroys the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, cuts the tomb down to the very bedrock, And it wasn't until after his death that the Byzantines were allowed to come back and rebuild that church. So pilgrimage was very dangerous in the beginning of the 11th century. Even though Europe was very prosperous, you have a population increase, you've got economic prosperity, you've got more and more people being encouraged by the church to go on pilgrimage, so you start to have this big issue, persecution escalating in one region, pilgrimage increasing at the same time. We hear stories in the 11th century of a number of other attacks. I'm going to sort of skim over these, individual nobles and bishops and groups that they were leading being attacked or blocked or even sold into slavery, especially when the Turks take over, because they take over Jerusalem in 1077, actually promise that they're not going to harm the inhabitants that are non-Muslim, but end up killing about 3,000 of them anyways, selling many more into slavery. And we do know by the time the Crusades began, pilgrims were actually being blocked by the Turks in particular. And I think it's clear that the Crusades were not unprovoked. The question is, why now? Why did the Crusades begin at the time that they begin? Part of it does a bit of a delayed response, I think. But then again, Muslim aggression is escalating at the 11th century. We have more reports coming back to Europe as, like I said, pilgrimage was increasing. And the church was seeking a unified empire, or not a unified empire, but a unified Europe. There was success for the first time in various parts of Europe pushing the Muslims back. And there was also a desire at this time to repair damage that had been done between the Western and Eastern churches after the Great Schism of 1054. And also the opportunity presented itself. You can see a number of events that I already mentioned. The last one, 1092, was the death of the Seljuk leader Malik Shah, which actually left the Turkish Empire in a little bit of disarray. There was competition between his sons and brothers over who was going to lead. And the Roman Emperor Alexius I sees this as an ideal opportunity to retake the land that the empire had lost. Around 1091, he did write a letter to Robert I, Count of Flanders, that describes what was going on. It says, "The empire of the Christians is daily being persecuted by the Pechenegs and Turks. The blood of Christians flows in unheard of scenes of carnage." And then he goes on to describe that. I'm not going to read the gruesome details there. At the end it says, "For almost the entire land has been invaded by the enemy from Jerusalem to Greece." And then he goes on, "We implore you to bring to this city all the faithful soldiers of Christ, to bring me aid, and to bring aid to all the Greek Christians." This was a cry for help. Alexius also sent ambassadors to the Council of Piacenza to ask the Pope for aid and other various European leaders. 1095, his ambassadors were also at the Council of Clermont, where the Crusades officially began. The Pope Urban II had already been kind of preparing this message and getting support by the secular leaders of Europe, and then makes his call for the Crusades official at Clermont. Now, given past Muslim aggression and the current state of events, the call for the First Crusade could be seen, I think, as a justifiable act according to just war theory, and I'll show you some of the reasons why in a second. We do know that Urban's call, the speech that he made at Clermont, is recorded in various accounts. They don't all agree on every single part, but they do agree as to the actual purpose of the mission. Let's just look briefly at the account by Faucher of Chartres. It says, "For your brethren who live in the East are in urgent need of your help, and you must hasten to give them aid, which has often been promised them. For as the most of you have heard, the Turk and the Arab have attacked them and have conquered the territory of Romania, as far west as the shores of the Mediterranean and the Hellespont." Going down a little bit further, "They have killed and captured many, and have destroyed the churches and devastated the empire. If you permit them to continue thus for a while with impurity, the faithful of God will be much more widely attacked by them. On this account, I, or rather the Lord, beseech you as Christ's heralds, to publish this everywhere, and to persuade all people of whatever rank, foot soldier, knight, poor and rich, to carry aid promptly to those Christians, to destroy that vile race from the land of our friends. I say this to those who are present, and also it meant also for those who are absent." By the way, the phrase there, rich and poor, he is talking about soldiers. He's not talking about just everybody. If you know anything about Crusade history, it ends up becoming a lot more than the Pope himself was thinking or planning. He goes on to say that all who die by the way, whether by land or sea, or in battle against the pagans, shall have immediate remission of sins. And I'll come back to this point in a little while as well. In his letter of instruction, which followed up with the various leaders who were going to take up the cross, he said again, "Your brothers, we believe, have long since learned from many accounts that the barbaric fury has deplorably afflicted and laid waste the churches of God in the regions of the Orient," and again is calling for help. Now, while you do have these varying accounts, like I said, they all do agree as the mission, and the mission in none of these accounts mentions anything about the conversion of Muslims to Christianity, which is what amazes me when I see scholars actually say the Crusades were about converting people to Christianity. That was never a mission. Excuse me. These wars were not about religious imperialism. They were about retaking Christian lands, protecting Christian lives. The purpose was to aid the Christian brethren in the East and to liberate Jerusalem. The commission was to take the vow of a pilgrim and to wear a cross. The promise that the church offered was to protect the land of those that went on the Crusades and also the remission of sins. The justification, was it a just cause? Well, we already saw that it is a response to Muslim aggression. It was after a long series of Muslim aggression and seemed to be a defensive necessity for both Eastern Europe and Eastern Rome. Europe and Eastern Rome. Excuse me. It was also called by legitimate authority. The Byzantine Empire sent out the original call. The Pope, who was an authority figure in his own right, thank you, sent the call out. And it was the secular leaders at the time that responded with their own armies. They had the right intention, which I think was to protect Christians who were in danger of losing their lives. As far as the principle of last resort, I think you can see after centuries, I can't imagine delaying any longer. Next question is whether they were justifiable as a religious action. That was the second question we're going to look at. And I think a case could be made that they were done as an act of Christian charity, but I think the question is more in relation to whether or not the Crusades are legitimate as a means of atonement. And here I would actually have to answer that they were not justifiable as a religious action. As far as a pilgrimage goes, I said they had this aspect of pilgrimage, and pilgrimage had a penitential aspect to them, an act of atonement. And I think this whole promise of remission of sins is not justifiable as an act of devotion, and I believe it's incompatible with the New Testament doctrine of salvation by faith and grace and not of works. And I think because you have such a promise, you do have some problems that develop later with actual conduct by various soldiers on these campaigns. In fact, the promise of glory in heaven for those that go on crusade, as you did see in the quote by Pope Urban, is obviously a huge motivation, but it's awful reminiscent of Islam's promise to the jihadis. Christianity as a religion, belief system, and relationship, however, cannot be judged on the basis of the acts of professing Christians. It must be judged according to the values and doctrines in the inherent foundational text of the New Testament, and the fact that one proclaims that something is God's will doesn't make it so. Regarding the church's promise, the fact that Christians make a claim, again, doesn't make it a Christian claim. And contrary to Christians, anything contrary to Christian scripture cannot be used to judge Christian faith. For instance, Ephesians is very clear that it is by grace that you have been saved through faith, not of works, so that no one can boast. And when a promise contrary to Scripture is made to motivate Christians to act, I don't think this should be viewed as Christian manipulation, but rather a manipulation of Christianity itself. Now, turning to the manner in which the Crusades were conducted, we can ask the same question. But I don't think it's possible to justify every single individual action that took place during the Crusades. In war, it's true, atrocities occurred, and many atrocities occurred during the Crusades. But the church and many of the Crusade leaders did try to maintain certain standards of behavior. It's just that on a practical level, that's very difficult to do in all instances. So let's look at some of the common accusations regarding Crusader motivation and conduct. First accusation is Crusaders are motivated by greed. The primary, greatest Crusade scholar of the modern world today, Jonathan Riley Smith, actually laid to waste the idea that the Crusaders are primarily poor knights seeking benefit, profit, or second sons that were off looking for land in the Near East. The fact is that most of the early Crusaders were the heads of families. They were the large landowners of Europe. They had a great amount of money that they were putting at risk, including selling off of their properties at home to raise the funds, because it took about 4 to 5 times your annual income to be able to go on crusade. And there's very little hope of profit. As a matter of fact, the main motive, according to the documents that we have, seems to be pious idealism. These were men that were very devout. They may not have understood every aspect of Christian doctrine correctly, but they believed in Christ. Some, of course, were participating for forgiveness of sins, but if you look at it, again, as an opportunity for
accumulating wealth, you got to understand that the Pope made it very clear any lands taken were supposed to go back to the Roman Empire, to Alexius I, and it was an act of penance. And if you were expecting to get wealthy from this, you would expect a lot more knights to actually take up the call. And only about 85 to 90% of knights did not go on crusade. And if they were interested in profit, they would have responded earlier when the Pope called for help to Spain, because Spain was closer, it was less costly to get there, it was less dangerous, and Spain was much more prosperous than the Near East. Yet most knights didn't go to the call in Spain either. And why was this? Why did they all of a sudden pick up and go to the Near East? And I think the difference is the fact that Jesus never walked in Spain. They were interested in going to the places where Jesus walked. Another accusation is the Crusades were actually called against the Jews. You'll hear this very often. In reality, this is not true. The Crusades were never called against the Jews. It was an unauthorized attack, several unauthorized attacks that were actually made, and these were primarily located in Germany. The church not only did not command it, they actually condemned it. And you could actually say that it was an unauthorized crusade, known as the People's Crusade, that kind of sparks the unauthorized German crusade as it sort of passes through. And this was begun by a guy known as Count Emico of Lesingen, who began to attack a number of German cities, Speyer, Mainz, Worms, Trier, Cologne. And the church definitely tried to stop this. You have bishops hiding Jews. In the city of Speyer, all but 12 Jews were actually saved by the church's interaction. The bishops were taking Jews into protection in other cities as well, but the mobs unfortunately broke down the palaces where the bishops were and actually drove some of the bishops out of those cities. And the church condemned the Pope himself condemned Count Emico, and luckily Emico died as he progressed further to the east. Second Crusade, actually that's what I should have gone to. In the Second Crusade, you see the same thing happen again by the anti-Semitic preachings of a monk by the name of Radolf, and again the church intervenes. The Bishop of Mainz calls for help, and the famous Bernard of Clairvaux comes personally to Germany to try to put an end to the persecution of Jews. And we actually have a record by a Jewish chronicler of the time who says this. This is Ephraim of Bonn, who says, "Then the Lord heard our sigh. He sent after the evil priest a decent priest, a great man. His name was Abbot Bernard from the city of Clairvaux, who said to them, 'It is fitting that you go forth against Muslims. However, anyone who attacks a Jew and tries to kill him, it is as though he attacks Jesus himself.'" Okay, so the church very much was against what unfortunately did happen with the Jewish communities. Another accusation is that the capture of Jerusalem was uniquely brutal, caused Muslim hatred of Europeans. We have records of up to 100,000 people slaughtered in the capture of Jerusalem. The Jews were being burned in the synagogue, Muslims killed in Al-Aqsa Mosque, and no mercy was offered. Descriptions going back to Europe say things like this: "Our men followed and pursued them, killing and hacking as far as the Temple of Solomon, and there was such a slaughter that our men were up to their ankles in the enemy's blood. Pilgrims pursued and killed the Saracens up to the Temple of Solomon," and so on. That's very graphic descriptions. Other letters that were sent back say, "If you desire to know what was done with the enemy who were found there, know that in Solomon's porch and in the temple our men rode in the blood of the Saracens up to the knees of their horses." Is this actual literal description of what went on? It's hard to believe that it could be, that you actually ride up to the knees of the horses in blood. It seems actually to be a rhetorical embellishment, a little bit of hyperbole. And as a matter of fact, it's a reference to Revelation 14 that talks about blood rising up to the bridles of the horses. So again, this is a way of speaking. Now, even if a mass slaughter did occur with the taking of Jerusalem, does this mean that the Crusaders have some kind of horrible barbarians that are just bloodthirsty? I don't think it does, because if you know anything about the rules of conduct for the time, this was very commonplace. When a city resists a siege and doesn't surrender before it's actually taken, it was commonplace for the inhabitants to be massacred as an example to others. Now, what exactly happened? In the sacking of the city, you can imagine most of the people would be killed at the time of breaching the walls. And the fact is that most of the population did flee the city. We do know the Christians themselves were expelled by the Muslims who occupied prior to the siege. And the numbers are also seem to be very much inflated. The earliest numbers that we have, which come from the 12th century, are about 20,000 people maybe in the city that were killed. And those numbers, interestingly, increase as time goes by until it's the 15th century documents that talk about 100,000 people. So the numbers are definitely inflated there. And the earliest Muslim records don't even mention numbers at all. As far as Jews and stuff being killed and burned in the synagogues, we do know that a lot of Jews were spared. As a matter of fact, the Cairo Geniza letters, which are found in Cairo back in 1952, indicate that a lot of Jews were actually ransomed and were given their freedom. Some of the leaders actually promised safe escape from the city by those who wished to go. So it was not a horrible slaughter the way some historians have actually made it seem, but nothing unusual for the time. Another accusation is the Muslims were persecuted in the intolerant Crusader states. The fact is that there were very prosperous conditions in the Crusader states. The Europeans were not interested in confiscating Muslim land. They did have lower taxes, and they administered fair justice for the most part. They also practiced tolerance for the Muslims. As opposed to this idea of forcing conversions of Muslims, they actually allowed Muslims to worship freely. Muslims were given their own sections of the city. There was never any effort to convert them. And we actually have records from Muslim chroniclers of the time, particularly this next one I'll show you. Ibn Jubair, who was a Spanish Muslim traveling in the Near East at the time through the Crusader states, says the inhabitants of the Christian lands were all Muslims, but they lived in comfort with the Franks. May God preserve them from temptation. Their dwellings belong to them, and all their property is unmolested. All the regions controlled by the Franks in Syria are subject to the same system. The landed domains, the villages and farms have remained in the hands of Muslims. Now, doubt invests the heart of a great number of these men when they compare their lot to that of their brothers living in Muslim territory. Indeed, the latter suffer from the injustice of their co-religionists, whereas the Franks act with equity. So here's a Muslim actually testifying to the fact that the Crusader states were a fair and just place to live. Another accusation, the Crusades accomplished nothing. They were a total failure. And it's true, it was only the first crusade that accomplished its goal, which was taking of Jerusalem. By 1187, Jerusalem had fallen. And by 1291, the Crusades had actually ended with no land left in Christian hands. But were there no benefits at all? Well, a lot of people will point to the fact that the Crusades did buy Europe time. Incursions into Europe drastically dropped off during the couple centuries during the Crusades. Battles were not being fought in places in Europe, but they were being fought in the Middle East. Kind of a side effect might be the fact that the Europeans brought back a lot of knowledge from the East with them. Of course, that's a little bit off the topic and off the point. Last accusation I'm going to look at is the Crusades are responsible for Muslim intolerance, that they initiated this rage among Muslims. They're imitating European rage, and the Crusades are the basis of modern Islamic anti-Western anger. The fact is, historically, that the Muslims in the Near East paid very little attention to the Crusades. Some Muslim chroniclers actually talk about the Crusades as an attack on the Turks, at least this is among the Arab Muslims. Ibn Zafir in the 12th century actually said it was better that the Franks occupied that territory than the Turks because it prevented the spread of the influence of the Turks into the land of Egypt. So some people take that position. The 20th century, or close to it, is when we start to see this idea of Crusades being a very negative thing. You have the first Muslim account of the Crusades written in 1899. In the 20th century, you've got the word crusade used as political propaganda during World War I, which causes some anger, especially when you realize that the Ottoman Empire, which was the major Muslim power at the time, was on the losing side of World War I. They had a very poor performance during the war. They kind of revealed the backwardness of Islamic culture, which embarrassed the Islamic world. And then after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, you have European colonization of a lot of that territory, and then later the founding of the State of Israel. A lot of these are responsible for modern anger. According to Jonathan Riley Smith, again the premier Crusade scholar, he says, one often reads that Muslims have inherited from their medieval ancestors bitter memories of the violence of the Crusaders. Nothing could be further from the truth. Before the end of the 19th century, Muslims had not shown much interest in the Crusades, looking back on them with indifference and complacency. Okay, so this is really a modern thing. So in conclusion, let's ask again the questions. Were the Crusades justifiable as a response to centuries of Muslim aggression, as a mission to protect Christians who were being assaulted in the Holy Land, and as called by legitimate authorities? I would say that they were justified. As a religious duty, as an act of penance, promise remission of sins, I would have to say no. They were not justifiable on those lines. Were all the actions of the Crusaders justifiable? Again, I would have to say no. But it's important to consider them in the accurate context and not mischaracterize them. So how important is an accurate view of the history regarding the Crusades? Well, reflecting back on the world situation and the events of 9/11, Thomas Madden, another Crusade scholar, asked the question, how did the Crusades lead to the present conflict today? And his reply, the answer is that they did not. It is not the Crusades that led to the attacks on September 11, but the artificial memory of the Crusades, constructed by modern colonial powers and passed down by Arab nationalists and Islamists, that stripped the medieval expeditions of every aspect of their age and dressed them up instead in tattered rags of 19th century imperialism. As such, they have become an icon for modern agendas that medieval Christians and Muslims could scarcely have understood, let alone condoned. If you're interested in more history on the Crusades, a couple recommendations that I have. Thomas Madden's book, A New Concise History, excellent introduction to the topic. Jonathan Riley Smith, everything he writes is well-researched and documented. His book, The Crusades, A History, is ideal for, again, introduction. And then Rodney Stark's book, God's Battalions, The Case for the Crusades, written by a Christian scholar of history, and highly recommend that as well. Hopefully you got something out of this talk. I know I went through a ton of material very quickly. I apologize, but if you have any questions, I think we're about out of time. Exactly. So I'd be happy to talk to you individually afterward, but as of this point, you're free to go.